Welcome to Edwardian Sleep Stories. Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight, we travel to London in February of 1909, to Platform 6 at Euston Station, a little before 8 in the evening, where the Highlands sleeping carriages stand under the great smoke-black roof with their blinds half drawn and small yellow lamps burning behind them, and the whole vast shed smells of steam and wet coats and hot oil. Among them is Thomas Ivison, a 47-year-old voicer of church organ pipes, carrying one flat mahogany box of voicing tools, one bundle of drawings tied with tape, and a grief he has carried up and down the country for 4.5 years without ever setting it down: a son, an apprentice, a scaffold in a church tower in Warwickshire. He expects only a berth, a cup of tea at Perth, and the long professional loneliness of a man who works alone in cold buildings. But somewhere north of Carlisle, in a corridor at 3 in the morning, he will be handed a cup of cocoa by a Highland sleeping car attendant named Dougal MacBean, who has spent 31 years learning what the night does to people who cannot rest. This is the story of Thomas Ivison and of one winter night on the road to Inverness, when a man whose entire trade was making things speak discovers that some silences are not faults to be corrected, but rooms to be sat in. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the sleeping carriage carry you through steam and darkness and sleep. Euston, at 8 o'clock on a February evening, was not a building so much as a weather system. Up in the roof, 70 feet above the platforms, the great arched ribs disappeared entirely into a brown haze of smoke and steam that hung there and moved slowly and never cleared, and through it, the arc lamps burned as small hard moons with rings around them. Down below, the noise came from everywhere and belonged to nobody. The hiss of a web compound blowing off further up, the slam of doors going away down the length of a train, like a stick dragged along railings, the enormous flat voice of a man announcing something that could not possibly be understood, trolleys with iron wheels going over the joints in the platform, a spaniel barking twice. Thomas Ivison stood beside the fourth vehicle of the 7:50 p.m. for the north and waited to be allowed aboard, with the mahogany box under his left arm, because he never let it go anywhere else. The sleeping carriage was a 12-wheeled London and Northwestern vehicle in plum and spilt milk, 45 feet of it, with a clerestory roof and brass handrails polished to the color of butter, and its own small chimney at one end for the attendant's stove. Its windows glowed. Behind the blinds, people were already moving about in the private lit interiors, and there is nothing in the world so warm-looking as a lit train from a cold platform, and nothing quite so much like an invitation. "Ivison," he said, when the attendant came down with the list. "Berth 7. "Aye, Mr. Ivison, we have you." The man was somewhere past 60, square and unhurried, in the company's dark uniform with the small brass numerals on the collar, and his voice came from a long way north of the station he was standing in. "Through to Inverness, is it? Through to Inverness? Then you're the only one in this vehicle that is, barring a lady in 3 going as far as Aviemore." He made a small mark. "You'll not be disturbed after Perth. In you come out of that." Thomas went up the 2 steps. The corridor was narrow and lined in mahogany, and it was as warm as a kitchen. That was the first thing. The heat came at him like a hand on the chest, an honest fug of steam pipe warmth and lamp oil and floor polish, and, underneath, the faint Swedish smell of the gas that lit the lamps. The floor was carpeted in a dark patterned wool. Along the left-hand side ran the doors of the compartments, each with a small brass number, and at the far end, an oval mirror caught the whole length of the passage and doubled it. Berth 7 was 2/3 of the way down. He put his head in and looked at it for a moment before going in, the way a man looks at a hotel room, taking its measure. 6 feet by 6.5. A bed made up along the outer wall with white sheets turned back over a dark blue blanket bearing the company's monogram, and a bolster and a second folded blanket at the foot. A washstand of mahogany with a lid that came down to make a shelf, and behind it a basin of white china let into the wood, and a tumbler in a nickel ring, and a carafe, a small round mirror, 2 hooks, a rack overhead, a window with a wide blind, and, beneath it, a heater grating with the steam pipe behind it, ticking gently as it warmed. And in the ceiling, in a little brass housing with a shade of frosted glass, the gas lamp, turned low, giving out a soft, unmoving amber light that made every surface in the compartment look like the inside of a violin. He sat down on the edge of the bed with the mahogany box on his knees. Outside on the platform, the trolleys went by, and a whistle blew somewhere for something else entirely, and a woman said, distinctly and cheerfully, "Well, he will have his own way, mother, and there's no use in it." Thomas Iveson had slept badly for 4.5 years, and he had long ago given up expecting a train to be an exception. But he had learned to be honest with himself about small pleasures, having so few, and the small pleasure here was undeniable, that in 11 hours' time, without doing anything at all, without any effort of his own, he would be 568 miles away, in a town he had never seen, in a different country, in the snow. At 8:02, the corridor lamps were turned up. At 7:50 exactly, the carriage gave a slight jolt, and the platform began to move. He was a voicer, which is a word most people have never had occasion to use. Anyone can build an organ, in the sense that anyone with sufficient patience and money can assemble a wind chest and a bellows and a set of metal tubes cut to the correct lengths. The instrument that results will make a noise. It will be, by any reasonable measurement, correct, and it will be perfectly, comprehensively dead, because a pipe out of the pipe maker's shop has not yet been made to speak, and until somebody makes it speak, it is only a piece of plumbing that happens to sound a note. That was the work. The firm of Rushmere and Son, of Bayham Street, Camden Town, employed 31 men, and of those 31, 4 were voicers, and Thomas Iveson had been the senior of them since 1898. He had come into it the ordinary way, at 14, sweeping shavings. Camden Town in the 70s was a place of workshops and small manufactories, of piano makers and organ builders, and men who did nothing but turn ivory, all of them jammed in behind the goods yards, and Rushmere's stood in a yard off Bayham Street, with double doors tall enough to take an assembled organ case and a hoist beam over them. The erecting shop went up 3 stories with a gallery round it. In the roof space were the drying racks for the timber. In the basement, the metal shop, where they cast pipe metal on a long stone bench, pouring molten tin and lead onto sailcloth and drawing it off flat with a wooden box, and rolling it and cutting it and shaping it round wooden mandrels, and where Thomas at 15 had burned the back of his right hand so badly that he still had the mark of it, a pale patch shaped rather like the Isle of Man. He had married Ellen Barrow in 1885. They had taken a small house in Rochester Terrace with a strip of garden and a lilac in it, and Ellen had grown things in pots with tremendous energy and moderate success. They had one son, Edward, born 1886. Edward had wanted the trade from the age of 6, and there had never been the slightest use in arguing. He was a bright, cheerful, dangerously confident boy, with his mother's coloring and his father's hands. At 14 he was apprenticed. At 17 he could scribe and fit a soundboard, as well as men twice his age. At 18 he had begun to be trusted with erection work in the field, which is the part of organ building that happens in a cold church 100 miles from anywhere, up ladders, with the vicar wanting to know when it will be finished. In September 1904, the firm had a contract at St. Chad's, Ilmington, in Warwickshire, a rebuilt instrument, a new case, and a chamber up beside the tower arch that had to be reached by a scaffold. There had been a question about a beam. Thomas had been on the floor of the nave with the drawings, and had called up, and Edward had gone up the outside of the scaffold to look at it, rather than round by the ladders, because he was 18, and because it was quicker, and because he had done it 100 times. A board that was not tied. 19 feet, he lived 4 days. There is no more to tell about it than that, and Thomas had never found any way of telling it that did not sound exactly like every other such story, which was in its own way the worst part. What happened afterwards was the part nobody warns you about. Ellen wept for a year and then began to be able to speak of him, and by the 3rd year she could say his name at the table quite naturally, in the middle of a sentence about something else. She joined a committee. She grew a fig against the south wall and was fiercely pleased with it. She was not healed. Thomas understood that perfectly well, but she had found some way of going on that involved letting the thing out of the house every so often to walk about. Thomas could not. That was the whole of it. He could not say the name. He had not said it aloud since the funeral. He could not go up a scaffold without a particular cold feeling behind the knees, which he concealed, and he could not, in any circumstances whatever, sit still and listen to music. That was the strangest part, and it had frightened him for a while. He could work brilliantly, better than ever, 12 hours at a stretch, on a single rank of pipes, but let him sit in a pew, and let the instrument be played, properly played, all the stops drawn, and the whole building filled, and something came up in his chest, like water rising in a lock, and he had to get out. He had left 3 dedication services. He had begun to arrange his work so that he finished the day before, and at home, in Rochester Terrace, he and Ellen had arrived, without either of them ever agreeing to it, at a silence, not a cold one. That was what made it so difficult to name. They were perfectly kind to each other. They discussed the coal and her sister at Ware, and whether the lilac wanted cutting back, but there was a room in the house they did not go into together, and it was not any of the actual rooms. He had taken to accepting the distant contracts. Cumberland, Norfolk, Wales, and now Inverness, a 3-manual instrument in a cathedral by the river, a rebuild and a revoicing, 6 weeks' work in a cold building in the middle of winter, 568 miles from Bayham Street. Ellen had packed his bag and put in a fruit cake and said, at the door, "Write on Sundays." "I will, Thomas." She had straightened his collar, which did not need it. "It's a long way." "It's the work. I know it's the work," she had said, and had gone back inside. He had thought about that all the way to Euston, on the top of an omnibus in the rain, and he was thinking about it now, in berth 7, with the lights of Camden going past the window 1.5 miles from his own front door, and he thought, with the flat, unsparing honesty that came to him only when he was tired, "She was not asking me to stay. She was asking me to come back different." The train ran out through Primrose Hill Tunnel, and the compartment went dark and roared, and came out the other side. He turned the gas up a little, opened the mahogany box, and looked at his tools, because that was what he did when he did not wish to think. The box was 2 feet by 9 inches, made by his own hands in 1881, out of Honduras mahogany left over from a console, with brass corners and a lid that fitted with the soft protesting sigh of well-cut wood. Inside, laid in a bed of green bases, in the order he had kept them for 28 years, the voicing knife, thin and short and worn hollow on one side from sharpening, 2 burnishers, a set of nicking files, the finest of them no thicker than a stiff hair, the languid tool for tilting, a pair of narrow-nosed pliers, 3 cones, small, medium, large, of turned boxwood, for opening and closing the tops of metal pipes, a brass tuning knife with a horn handle that had belonged to old Mr. Rushmere, and before him to a man in Bristol whose name nobody now remembered, a folded leather, a pot of beeswax, a steel rule, and in the lid, held under 2 straps, a small tuning fork, A, 435 vibrations, which had been Edward's. Thomas closed the lid on that part, without looking at it directly, in the practiced way of a man skirting a hole in a floor. Voicing. How to explain voicing to a person who has never done it? Take an open metal flue pipe, say a 4-foot C from a principal rank, a tube of spotted metal about 4 feet long and 2.5 inches across, with a foot below and a mouth cut into the front of it and a flat lip top and bottom. Wind goes into the foot, comes up through a narrow slit called the flue, strikes the upper lip, and the sheet of air divides and oscillates, and the column of air in the tube takes it up, and there is a note. That is the theory, and it takes 90 seconds to learn, and it is worth exactly nothing. Because when the pipe comes from the metal shop, it does not do that. It hisses, or it overblows and screams a note an octave up, or it speaks and then falls away, or it takes half a second to decide, an eternity, an insult, and comes on with a little slap at the front of it, like a man clearing his throat before every word he says. Or it is simply thin and correct and hateful, and the voicer sits down at a bench, a small wind chest with a bellows worked by a treadle, and a rack, and a good chair, and a north light if he is lucky, and takes that pipe and makes it speak. He opens the toe a little with the boxwood cone, letting in more wind, and listens. He closes it a fraction and listens. He takes the languid tool and tilts the languid, the flat plate inside the mouth, by an amount that would not show on a rule. He nicks the languid edge with the finest file, 11 small notches, or 14, or 9, spaced by eye, and each nick takes a grain of harshness out of the attack, and a grain of brightness out of the tone, and the whole art lies in knowing when to stop, because you can never put a nick back. He cuts the mouth higher for a rounder, slower, flutier note, and that too cannot be undone. He curves the upper lip. He tries it again. He treads the bellows and holds the pipe in the rack and puts his ear 18 inches from the mouth and listens with his eyes shut. And then he does it again for the next pipe, and there are 61 pipes in a rank, and perhaps 22 ranks in the instrument, and every one of the 1,342 must not only speak well in itself, but must speak as a family. The same character, the same promptness, the same soul, changing smoothly and imperceptibly from the great slow basses to the little bright trebles, no longer than a finger. 6 weeks of work, 10 hours a day, to make one instrument sound like one thing. And here was what Thomas Iveson knew, that he had never once said to a customer. The whole of it depended on the wind being steady. Nothing else mattered if the wind was wrong. You could voice a rank perfectly on the bench, and set it in a building with an unsteady supply, and every pipe you had labored over would waver and sag and pull at the moment of speech, because a pipe is only a mouth, and a mouth without breath behind it can do nothing at all. The bellows, the reservoir, the weights, the concussion bellows that took out the shock, that unglamorous plumbing under the floor that no congregation ever saw and no organist ever thought about, that was where the tone lived. Steady wind and a mediocre pipe would sing. Perfect pipes on bad wind would embarrass you in front of a bishop. He had said so to Edward, in the erecting shop, more than once, in the tone of a man laying down law. Steady wind first, boy. Everything after. The train was crossing Watford Junction now. He registered the shift in the rhythm of the joints, the lights of the platform going by in one long smear, the momentary bang of another train passing in the opposite direction that made the window shudder. Thomas laid the tuning knife back in its bays and closed the box and put it in the rack overhead and sat for a while with his hands on his knees. A little after 9, the attendant came along the corridor with a tray and put his head round. "Tea, Mr. Iveson? There's biscuits with it, and I'd take them if I were you, for there'll be nothing else this side of Crewe. Thank you, yes." The man set it down on the washstand shelf. "Macbean," he said, as though completing an introduction begun some time ago. "I'm through the night if you want anything at all. There's a bell there by the bolster, and it rings in my compartment, and it doesn't trouble me in the slightest, so use it." "I sleep badly," said Thomas, and was astonished at himself for saying it. Macbean did not appear to find the remark strange in any way. "Most do, the first hour," he said. "It's a great deal of noise for a body that's used to a bedroom. It settles." He straightened the tray a quarter of an inch. "And if it doesn't settle, come and stand at the end of the corridor by the window. There's no rule against it, and you'd not be the first." He went out and slid the door to, and the compartment was very quiet, and the train ran north. By 9:30, the train had settled into the long stride it would keep for the next 4 hours, and Thomas Iveson began, without much conviction, to prepare himself for bed. There is an entire small ceremony to going to bed on a train, and nobody teaches it to you, and everyone conducts it slightly wrong the first time. He hung his coat on the hook, where it swung a little, and then found a rhythm of its own, out and back, in perfect agreement with the carriage. He put his boots under the bed and immediately regretted it and put them at the foot instead, where he could find them without a lamp. His collar and studs went into the small nickel dish on the washstand, and he discovered why the dish had a raised rim, which was the sort of thing he admired. Somebody had thought about it. Somebody had lain in a berth at 2 a.m, listening to a collar stud roll about, and had gone in and drawn a rim on the drawing. He washed his face at the china basin. The water was tepid and smelled faintly of the tank, and there was a nickel tap with a spring in it that shut of its own accord the instant you let go, so that washing was necessarily a two-handed business conducted at an awkward angle. And Thomas, who had spent his life among mechanisms and could not help himself, worked out the reason for that too, which was that a running tap on a train that stops suddenly is a flooded floor. He turned the gas down to a bead. Then he lay on the bed in his shirt with the blue blanket over him and his hands behind his head, and he listened. This was the thing. This was what he had not expected. A train at speed does not make a noise. It makes an architecture of noises, and they are all at different distances. Closest, immediately beneath him, through the mattress and the frame and the floor, the wheels over the rail joints, that 4-beat figure, ta-tum, ta-tum, the front bogie and then the rear, endlessly repeated at about a second and a half, so regular that after 10 minutes he could no longer hear it as separate sounds, but only as a kind of pulse in the body of the carriage. Above that, the long, continuous sibilance of the wheels on the rail itself, a sound like a river heard from 100 yards. Then, at a middle distance, the small conversation of the vehicle, a faint creak from the corridor partition when the train took a curve, the almost inaudible chime of the tumbler against the nickel ring, the tick and settle of the steam heater under the window as it took the wind, a rattle in the door catch that came and went. And then, far off, at the head of the train, half a mile away as it seemed, the engine. He could not hear the exhaust properly at that speed. It had blurred into a general roar carried back along the coaches. But every so often, at a signal box, or a level crossing, or the mouth of a cutting, the whistle went, and it came back down the train to him, thinned and flattened and mournful and beautiful, and then the sound would be swallowed instantly by a bridge and reappear. He lay in the dark and, from long habit, tried to name the pitch of the whistle. He got it after the third one, a rough A-flat, with a good deal of noise in it, and a distinct second above, which meant 2 chambers slightly out with each other. It would have been a very poor organ pipe. It was, as a sound in the night in February, close to perfect. That was the trouble with his trade. It had taught him to hear everything, and then had taken away his ability to simply listen. At Rugby, the train slowed, and the rhythm broke up and reassembled, points, and the long rolling clatter of a junction, and lights swinging past the blind's edge in bars, and someone got on further down. At Nuneaton, it did not stop. Some time after that, Thomas fell asleep for perhaps 40 minutes, which was the longest single stretch he had managed in a fortnight, and woke, because the train had stopped altogether, and the silence was enormous. He raised the blind 2 inches. Crew. 11:30, and the great junction lay under its arc lamps with a fine sleet drifting across them. There were tracks going away in every direction, gleaming faintly, and rows of stationary carriages with their windows dark, and a locomotive standing alone on a spur, with a man in the cab leaning out on his elbows, and a shovel fire glowing red on his face and chest. 2 men walked along the ballast with a lamp and a long-spouted oil can, going from axle box to axle box down the train, and Thomas heard them come nearer. A clink, 3 steps, a clink, 3 steps, and pass beneath his own window, and go on. Someone was uncoupling something. There was a great iron clash, and a hiss of released vacuum, and then a series of buffer shunts running away up the train. Bang, 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 diminishing. He watched a man in a heavy coat walk the whole length of the platform, pushing a churn on a trolley, and vanish into a doorway of yellow light. It struck him, watching, that all of this was happening at 11:30 at night, in the sleet in Cheshire, and would happen again tomorrow, and had happened last night, and that some hundreds of men were awake and working in the cold, so that some hundreds of other people could be asleep and moving north at 50 miles an hour, without any idea whatever that it was going on. That was, he thought, very like an organ, all the machinery under the floor. Nobody sees the bellows. At 16 minutes to 12, the carriage jolted gently, and Crewe began to slide backwards, and Thomas Iveson dropped the blind and lay down again in the dark, and the 4-beat figure came back under him, slow at first, then quicker, then settling. North of Crewe, the country goes flat and dark and industrial for a while, and then, quite gradually, it stops being flat and stops being industrial and begins to be something else entirely, and there is no particular place where this happens. Thomas did not sleep, but he had stopped minding about it, which was itself unusual, and he lay on his side with the blind up 6 inches and watched the night go past. Warrington gave him a red sky. He raised himself on one elbow to see it. A low bank of cloud lit from beneath, in a sullen orange rose, and beneath that, the actual furnaces, 3 of them, opening and closing, and the black stalks of chimneys against it, and a canal, somewhere reflecting the whole business back at itself, in a long broken smear. It went on for 2 or 3 miles, and then closed up behind them. Wigan smelled, even through a shut window, of coal and something chemical. Preston came at 12:30 as a scatter of gas lamps, mill walls 5 stories high with every window black, and the sudden flat gleam of the Ribble under a bridge. He caught, very briefly, the shape of a church tower against the sky, and thought, because he could not stop himself. Preston Parish Church, 3 manuals, Hill, 1885, and the swell box, was never large enough. And then he laughed silently at himself in the dark and lay down again. After Preston, the lights thinned. That was the change. There had been lights of some kind, somewhere, ever since Euston. Always a farmhouse, always a signal, always a distant town making its glow on the underside of the cloud. Now there began to be gaps, real gaps. 2 minutes, 3 minutes of absolute darkness, with nothing in it but his own faint reflection in the glass, and then one small yellow window, a mile off, across a field, gone before he could wonder about it. At Lancaster, the train ran along the estuary, and there was, briefly, a great pale sheet of water on the left-hand side, with the tide out and the sand shining, and a line of hills beyond it that were blacker than the sky. And then, past Carnforth, the ground began to lift. He felt it before he understood it. The rhythm changed, not the rate of the wheels, but the effort behind them, a new heaviness in the way the carriage moved, and away up front, the engine's exhaust came back to him for the first time as a distinct sound. 4 sharp beats to the revolution, hard and rapid and gathering echo off the cuttings, and the whole train pulling like something with its head down. Thomas sat up in his berth and put the blind right to the top. Westmoreland went by in silhouette. He could see very little, and it was extraordinary. Bare hillsides going up on both sides, walls of dry stone running at improbable angles across the slopes, and here and there, the black shape of a single thorn tree bent one way by a wind that had evidently been blowing from the same quarter for 200 years. Snow was lying in the gullies in long white streaks, and where the moon came through a break in the cloud, the whole fell side turned briefly the color of pewter, and then went out. They took a banking engine at Oxenholme. He heard it come on at the rear with a solid clang, and felt the push of it through the couplings. Then the long grind-up grey rig, and a dip, and the harder grind after Tebay, where the line goes up at 1 in 75 for 4 miles, and the two engines between them made a noise you could feel in the frame of the bed, a slow, deliberate, 4-square pounding, gaining and losing against each other, a great animal walking uphill in the dark. He put his hand flat on the window. It was very cold, and it thrummed. They came over Shap's summit, 914 feet, a wilderness of nothing at all, a signal box with one lit window, standing entirely alone in the middle of a black moor, with the snow driving past its lamp, and then the engine's exhaust cut off altogether, and the sound of the train changed to a freewheeling rush, and the carriage tilted very slightly forward and began to run downhill. The banker dropped away. The whistle went, twice, thin and far off, thanking somebody. Something happened in Thomas Iveson's chest at that moment, which he did not entirely understand, and it was not sorrow. It was closer to gratitude, and it was directed at nobody in particular, at the men on the footplate perhaps, whom he would never see, at whoever had built the wall running up the fell, at the fact that the world was so much larger than Bayham Street, at the plain animal comfort of being warm and horizontal, while going 40 miles an hour through a winter moor, with the snow going past the glass. He lay back and watched the darkness and the snow. At Penrith, the lights came back for half a minute. At Carlisle, the train stopped and stood, and there was a great deal of activity outside with the mails, and a Caledonian engine came on in place of the northwestern one. He heard the change, the different note of the whistle, a bright true B natural, where the other had been that rough A flat, and Thomas thought, drowsily, that he had now crossed into another country lying down, and without a passport, and without so much as sitting up. At 20 to 3, the train pulled out of Carlisle into Scotland, and Thomas Iveson had been awake for 20 hours and could not sleep, and got up, and put on his coat over his shirt, and went to stand in the corridor. The corridor at 3 in the morning was warm and dim and empty, and it swayed. The lamps had been turned right down, so that there was only a soft bead of amber in each brass housing, and the mahogany gave it back in long, muted gleams. The carpet took every footfall. Along the compartment doors, the small brass numerals showed faintly. At the far end, the oval mirror held the whole passage in a single dark shining oblong, and Thomas's own reflection stood at the other end of it, unrecognizably small. He went to the end window and put his hands on the rail and looked out at Dumfriesshire. There was more snow here, real snow, an inch or two of it lying, so that the fields showed grey-white in the darkness and the walls ran across them in black lines. The sky had cleared. Away off to the east, above a long, low ridge, there were stars, very hard, very small, very cold, and the moon was down somewhere behind the train, so that everything in the landscape had a faint shadow the wrong way round. The line was climbing again. Beaddock Bank, 10 miles of it, 1 in 74 for the last 7, and away up front, the Caledonian engine had settled into a grim and unhurried assault upon it. The beats came back, slow and enormous. The carriage rocked steadily. Snow lay along the ledges of the cuttings, and once, on the roof of a platlayer's hut with a wisp of smoke coming out of it, and Thomas thought about the man inside and hoped he had tea. "You'll not sleep standing," said Dougal MacBean. He had come along the corridor without a sound, in slippers, with his uniform jacket unbuttoned at the neck and a mug in each hand, and he handed one over without asking whether it was wanted, which is the only correct way to give a man something at 3 in the morning. It was cocoa. It was extremely hot and rather too sweet. "Thank you." Macbean set his elbows on the rail beside him, and the two of them looked out at the snow together, in the way that men do, side by side, not facing each other, which makes almost anything possible to say. "Do you always give cocoa to the passengers who can't sleep?" "I do, and to the ones that can, if they wake and ring. I've a spirit stove, and I've nothing else to do between Carlisle and Symington, but keep the stove going, and see to the boxes at Beothuk, and a man may as well be useful as sit." He drank. "You'd be surprised how many walk out here. 31 years I've had this run, and there's 1 or 2 every night. 31 years, since 78. First on the Highland, then this, then back and forth." He nodded at the window. "I've seen that hill in every condition God has. There's a night in the March of '95 I'll not forget, but that's another matter." The train labored. Somewhere in the fields a light moved, low down, and Thomas watched it and worked out after a while that it was a lantern being carried by a man walking, at 3 in the morning, in the snow, in Dumfriesshire, going about some business of his own. "May I ask you something?" Thomas said. "You may." "What is it about the night that makes people come out and stand in a corridor?" Macbean considered this for some distance. "Well," he said at last, "I'll tell you what I think, and I'm no scholar. I think it's because the day has a great many jobs in it, and a man can hide behind them very comfortably. And the night has none, and what's been standing quiet in the back of him all day comes forward about 2 o'clock and taps him on the shoulder and says, 'Right then,' and most folk find they'd rather stand up and look at a hill than lie down and be tapped." "That is exactly right," said Thomas. Well." Macbean sounded faintly embarrassed. "It's not clever. It's only what you see, doing this. You get the whole of a person in a corridor at 3. They're not dressed for company, and they've not had time to think of anything to be." He turned his mug round in his hands. "What's your trade, Mr. Iveson?" "You've hands like a joiner and a box you'll not let out of your sight." "Organs." I voice the pipes. "Do you now?" Macbean straightened up slightly. "There's a wee organ at Inverness Cathedral. My sister's man sings in that choir and complains about it at every family gathering these 14 years. Thomas laughed out loud, a short, surprised sound, the first in some time. "Then he will be pleased with me," he said, "in about 6 weeks, and unbearable about it for the rest of his life." "He will," Macbean agreed comfortably. "He's that sort. And what does it mean then? Voicing, for I've heard the word and never troubled to find out." And Thomas Iveson, standing in a swaying corridor at 3:10 in the morning, going up Beothuk Bank in the snow, with a mug of oversweet cocoa in his hand, found that he was explaining his trade to a stranger with more enthusiasm than he had felt about anything in 4.5 years. Beothuk summit came at 3:20, announced by nothing except a change in the engine's voice. The pounding stopped, and the exhaust went soft, and the train came over the top and began to run down toward Elvenfoot with the free rushing sound of something released. "Come away in," said Macbean. "I'll not have you standing here for 2 hours, and my cocoa going cold in your hand." The attendant's compartment was at the London end of the carriage, and was, Thomas discovered, one of the most efficiently arranged spaces he had ever been in, and he had spent his life in workshops, where a man's whole reputation could be read off the wall behind his bench. It was perhaps 5 feet by 6. Along one side ran a narrow bunk, made up, but plainly not used, with a folded greatcoat on it. Above that, a rack with a row of numbered pigeonholes for the tickets and the passengers' boots. On the opposite side, a cupboard with a drop front, and behind the drop front an entire small kitchen, a spirit stove in a gimbaled brass ring with a pan of water on it, breathing, a tin of cocoa, a tin of tea, a caddy spoon on a string, 6 white china cups in a rack with a bar across, a jug of milk standing in a bowl of cold water, 2 lemons in a paper bag, a tin of arrowroot biscuits. There was a hook for a lantern. There was a small folding seat, worn shiny. There was a shelf with a Bible, a Bradshaw, and a well-thumbed volume with no lettering left on the spine. There was a card of ready-threaded needles pinned to the paneling, and beside it, a photograph in a passe-partout frame of a young woman and 2 children, taken outdoors, squinting. Nothing was loose. Nothing could rattle. Every single object in the room was either in a rack, in a ring, behind a bar, or on a hook, and the whole thing swayed as one piece with the train. "You have this very well arranged," said Thomas, with real admiration. Macbean looked pleased in the manner of a man who has waited some years to be complimented on the right thing. "In 31 years," he said, "you learn what falls. Sit you down there." Thomas sat on the folding seat, with his back against the bulkhead, and his cocoa in his hand, and the whole carriage, rocking gently through the Lanarkshire dark, and he thought that it was very strange to be so comfortable. "Now then," said Macbean, refilling the pan from a can, voicing, "You'll be sorry you asked. I have been sorry a great many times, and it never yet killed me." So Thomas told him. He began with the thing everybody gets wrong, that people imagine an organ builder builds an instrument and then it plays, and that the sound is in the design, the way the shape of a bell is in the mold. And he explained that it is not so at all, that a rank of pipes arrives from the metal shop dumb, that they will make a noise, but not a ball tone, and that a man must sit down with each one in turn, and work on it with knives and files and cones, until it says what it is meant to say. He described the voicing bench, the little wind chest, the treadle, the north window. He described nicking, the 11 small notches on the languid edge, each taking away a grain of the harshness at the front of the note, each irreversible. He described cutting up a mouth, and how 1/100th of an inch changes a principle into something with a hollow flute in it. He described the way a bad pipe hisses, and the way a good one comes on cleanly with just a breath of shift before the note, like a consonant before a vowel, and that is the whole beauty of it, that little sound at the start, because that is where a pipe sounds like a living thing, rather than a whistle. And how do you know when you've done enough? You don't. You listen. If you're wrong, you can't go back. There's no putting metal on, so you take away a very little, and then you stop, and you listen for longer than you think you need to. He turned the cup in his hands. Old Rushmere used to say, "The difference between a voicer and a butcher is 4 seconds. Macbean laughed. 1 syllable. And the rest of it? There's more to an organ than pipes. There is a great deal more, and none of it matters. Thomas set the cup down on the ledge, where there was a small hollow turned in the wood to hold it. Of course there was. You may have the finest pipes in Europe, and if your wind is not steady, you have nothing at all. Wind, the bellows, the reservoir, the weights on it, the feeders, the concussion bellows, all of it under the floor, where nobody looks. He found he was speaking with his hands now. You see, a pipe cannot make its own note. It has nothing in it. It is a tube. It is entirely dependent on a steady supply of wind at a constant pressure. And if that supply wavers, if it drops by 1/2 inch of water when 6 stops are drawn, then every pipe in the building sags together, and everybody in the church hears it, and nobody knows what they have heard. They only feel that something is wrong. They go home and say the organ is a poor one. And it's not the organ. It's never the organ. It's the breathing. Thomas stopped, because he had heard what he had just said, and Macbean was looking at the pan on the stove, and not at him at all, which is a courtesy some men have, and cannot be taught. The train ran on. Away past Abington the moors came down close on both sides, bare and white under the snow. and the burns in the bottoms of the cuttings ran black. "You'll take a biscuit," said Macbean. "I will." The tin was opened and passed. It contained, in the manner of such tins everywhere, 3 arrowroot biscuits and a great many crumbs. "So, it's the bellows that does the work," Macbean said, "and the pipes that get the credit. That is the trade in one sentence. And if a man came to you and said, 'My organ's poorly, come and fix the pipes,' what would you tell him?" "I would ask to see the blowing plant first, and he would be annoyed, and I would go down into the cellar with a candle and find that the reservoir was leaking at the gussets and hadn't been re-leathered since 1870. Thomas ate the biscuit. It is nearly always the leather. Leather perishes. It is the one part of the whole instrument made of something that was once alive, and it behaves accordingly. Everything else, the tin, the oak, the brass, will outlast all of us. The leather goes." Macbean was quiet a moment. "Do they mind that, your customers? Being told the fault's not where they thought?" "They hate it," said Thomas. "Every one of them. They have come to you about the sound, which is the interesting part, the part they can hear, and you tell them the trouble is 100 weight of sheepskin under the floor that nobody has thought about for 40 years. He shook his head slowly. "And what they say, always, without fail, is, 'But it was perfectly all right last year.' And was it? No. It was failing last year and the year before that, at a rate too slow for anyone to notice, and they compensated. That's what people do. The wind drops a little, so the organist draws an extra stop, and that makes it worse. So next year he draws another, and by the time he calls us in, he has been playing a crippled instrument for a decade with both hands, and has entirely forgotten what it sounded like when it was whole." The pan came to the boil. Macbean took it off with a cloth and set it on the iron ledge, and the sound of it filled the little room for a moment. "That's the part I'd not have guessed," he said. "The compensating. It's the worst of it, because the man is not lying. He truly does not know. He has adjusted so gradually that he has no memory of any other way of playing." Thomas turned his hands over and looked at them. The burn from 1876, shaped like the Isle of Man, the calluses along the first joints, the nail on the left forefinger that had never grown right since 1893. "And when you have done the work, when you have put in new leather and set the weights and made the wind steady again, do you know what happens? Tell me." He plays with all the stops he has been using, and it is appalling. It's far too much. The whole thing bellows at him, and he takes his hands off the keys and he sits there looking rather frightened, and he says, "What have you done to it?" Thomas smiled a little, without much in it, and I say, "Nothing. I have only given you the wind. You have been leaning on that instrument for 10 years, and now there is nothing to lean on." Macbean poured, deliberately, into both cups. And then he must learn to play again, which takes about 6 months, and most of them do it, and it is the best part of the job, and the part I am never there to see. The attendant handed him the cup, and then, in the same easy tone in which he had asked about the biscuits, without any change of gear whatsoever, he said, "How long have you been drawing extra stops, Mr. Iveson?" Thomas did not answer for a considerable time. Outside, the train went over a bridge, and the sound changed and came back. He looked at the photograph in the passepartout frame, and at the card of ready-threaded needles, and at the water in the bowl in which the milk jug stood. 4 years and 5 months, he said. My son, he was 18. He fell from a scaffold in a church at Ilmington, in Warwickshire, in the September of '4, and it was a board that was not tied, and I had called him up to look at a beam. There, he had said it. Not the name, he could not do the name, but the rest of it, out loud, in a 5x6 compartment, on a moving train to a man he had met 4 hours ago, having told nobody in 4.5 years, not his wife, not his partners, not the doctor in Camden Road, who had asked him twice. Macbean did not say he was sorry, and did not say it was not his fault. and did not say anything at all for a while. He drank his cocoa. The train ran down toward Carstairs and began, gently, to slow. "There's the junction," he said at last. "We'll drop the Edinburgh portion here and stand 10 minutes. I'll have to go out." He put his cup in the rack behind the bar. "You'd be welcome to stop where you are. There's nobody rings before Perth." He went to the door and paused with his hand on it and looked back. "You'll not mind me saying it," he said. "You've spent 4 years and 5 months holding your own instrument together by leaning on it, and a man can do that. It works. It works right up until it doesn't, and then it goes all at once, and there's nothing left in the barrel." He nodded once, as though they had agreed on something. Yon leather perishes, and he went out into the corridor to see to the boxes, and Thomas Iveson sat alone in a small warm room with a spirit stove, and listened to the train coming into Carstairs in the snow. They lay at Carstairs for 12 minutes. Thomas went back to his own compartment, because it seemed wrong to be found sitting in another man's chair, and he raised the blind and watched the junction do its work. It was a bleak place at 4 in the morning, a windswept island of platforms in the middle of a moor, with the snow going across the lamps in horizontal streaks, and a wind that got in past the window frame and touched his face. The Edinburgh coaches were drawn off by a small tank engine that shoved and squealed and blew off deafeningly. A man came down the train with a hammer on a long handle and struck every tire in turn, a bright ringing note, walking away down the platform. Ting, 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 12 of them, then a pause, then 12 more. And Thomas listened to the pitch, changing from vehicle to vehicle, and thought, helplessly, that it was a rank of pipes very badly out of tune, and that the man with the hammer was voicing the entire train. Then the whistle, and the jolt, and the platform lamps sliding away, and northward again. After Carstairs, the line came down out of the moors into the Clyde Valley, and the country softened for a while. Orchard country, though he could not see it, and the river running alongside, and here and there a stone farmhouse with a light already burning in a downstairs window at 4:20, because somebody had cows. Motherwell and the ironworks. A sudden and astonishing 3 minutes of hell in the middle of the night. The whole sky rose red. Furnaces standing open, a slag tip somewhere pouring a white-hot ribbon down a black hillside, so bright that Thomas had to look away and could still see it on the inside of his eyelids. Then it was gone, and the darkness afterwards was absolute. Glasgow, they skirted rather than entered. Then the Clyde again, wide and black, and a long viaduct with the Sound going hollow underneath, and away to the left a scatter of ships' masts and cranes standing against a sky that was, he realized with a small shock, not quite as black as it had been. At Larbert, the fields were white and level. At Stirling, the train slowed for the curve, and Thomas saw the Castle Rock stand up out of the flat karst to the west, a black, abrupt mass with the snow on its shoulders, and one lamp burning somewhere impossibly high up on it, and beyond it, very faintly, the first suggestion that there were mountains out there, and that they were much larger than anything he had ever considered. North of Stirling, the country changed for good. The Vale of Strathmore ran away on both sides in long, low, white fields, hedgeless, divided by dikes, with plantations of black firs standing in blocks. There was no smoke anywhere. There were no mills. Every 20 minutes there was a little station with 2 oil lamps and a name board he could not read, and a station master's house with a garden, and a signal arm standing up green, and then nothing again for miles. The sky in the east had begun to go from black to a very dark blue. Thomas lay on top of the blankets with his coat over him and watched it happen, and he found that his mind had gone very quiet, and that he was not thinking about anything at all, and that this was so unfamiliar a condition that he examined it for a moment and nearly frightened it away. At 5:03, the train came into Perth. They stood there a long while, nearly half an hour, because at Perth in those days The night trains from the south came together and were sorted and reformed, and portions were exchanged for Aberdeen and Dundee and the north, and the whole business was conducted at a walking pace under gas lamps with a great deal of shunting and no visible hurry whatever. Thomas raised the blind and lay watching the roof girders slide past. Perth Station had a long, high iron and glass overall roof, and beneath it there was, at that hour, a particular sort of life. Barrows of mail, a man asleep sitting up on a bench with his cap over his face, 2 porters carrying a wicker hamper between them with tremendous care, a woman in a shawl selling nothing at all to nobody, apparently for the company, steam standing up in the still air and hanging in the girders. There came a knock. MacBean put his head in. "We'll be here 20 minutes, yet there's a bogey to come off. I'd be glad if you'd try to sleep now, Mr. Iveson. For once we're away, it's 4 hours of the Highland line, and it's the finest thing in Britain, and you'll be sorry if you're too tired to look at it." "I doubt I shall sleep." "Aye, so you keep saying." MacBean glanced at him with mild professional interest. "It's a great deal of effort, mind, doubting. I've often thought it's harder work than the sleeping." He slid the door shut. But he came back 10 minutes later with 2 fresh cups, having evidently decided something, and sat down on the edge of the seat by the door, with his cap off, which he had not done before. "I said there was a night in the March of '95, he said. "You'll have this, and then I'll leave you be." Thomas took the cup. "I was on the Highland then," MacBean said. "Perth to Inverness, and the sleeper wasn't near so grand as this. There was a blizzard came in on the 9th of that month, out of the northeast, and it caught the whole of the line from Blair Athol clear over the summit, and it was not an ordinary storm. There'd been snow lying a fortnight, and it was dry as sand, and the wind picked it up and put it into the cuttings, and a cutting fills quicker than any man believes who's not seen it." He turned his cap round in his hands as he talked. "We stuck at Dalnaspidal. 2:30 in the morning, 1,500 feet up, and the drift was to the top of the carriage doors on the weather side. 2 engines and 11 vehicles, and about 70 souls, and no getting forward, and no getting back, and the wires down. How long? 26 hours. He said it without any particular emphasis. Now, here's what I want to tell you, and it's not the part folk expect. It was a very great deal quieter than you'd think. Once it was plain we weren't moving. There was nothing at all to do. The engines kept steam for the heating as long as the coal lasted, and after that we'd blankets and each other, and people were, he searched for it, they were. There was a farmer had a ham, and he cut it up for the whole train, and a lady with a hamper of Perth pies for a wedding gave up every one of them, and never said a word about the wedding. There was a wee lad of 6 that had the time of his life, and there was a minister that prayed over us, and a commercial traveler that told him to give it a rest, and they made it up before morning, and shared a pipe. And you? I made cocoa, said MacBean, for 26 hours, until the spirit ran out, and then I made nothing, and then a man from the plough came through the drift on foot at 4:30 the next day. He drank. That's not the part I meant to tell you either. Here's the part. He set the cup down. My wife had died the November before. Consumption. We'd 2 bairns, and my sister had them at Kingussie while I worked, and I'd been on the line every night since the funeral, every single night, taking every turn I could get, and swapping for the ones I couldn't, because the one thing on this earth I could not do was be in a room at night with nothing happening. Thomas said nothing. 26 hours at Dalnaspidal, said MacBean. 1,500 feet up in a drift with no engine and no wires and nothing to do. He smiled slightly. The Almighty has a heavy hand with a joke. What did you do? I sat in this same wee room in the vehicle I had then, and it went dark and cold, and about the second night I stopped being able to keep my hands busy, and it came at me all at once. Everything I'd been running from since the November, and I'll not describe it to you, because there's no describing it, and it doesn't want describing. It went on some hours, and then it stopped. It stopped? It stopped, said MacBean. That's the whole of what I know, Mr. Iveson, and it's not much, and I've had 14 years to make more of it, and I never could. It stopped. I did not die of it. I was still sitting there at the finish, and I was cold, and my face was a sight, and I was still the same man, and the drift was still there, and Mary was still dead, and I found— He lifted a hand and let it fall. I found I could hold it. It was heavy, but I could hold it. And I'd spent 4 months in the belief that if ever I put my hands on it, it would go through me like a bar. The station clock outside said 5:20. Somewhere down the train, a door slammed. It's the running that costs you, said MacBean, not the thing itself. The thing itself has a bottom to it. You go down and down, and then at some point, your feet find something. But the running has no bottom at all, for there's always more line. He stood up and put his cap on, and became, instantly and entirely, a railway servant again. We'll be away in 5 minutes, he said. You'll not be disturbed. There's the bell if you want me. At the door he stopped. Your boy, he said. What was he called? Thomas Iveson opened his mouth and closed it, and looked at the small brass catch on the washstand for a long moment. Edward, he said. Aye, said MacBean gently. That's a good name, and he slid the door shut behind him. The train pulled out of Perth at 6:25. Thomas Iveson sat on the edge of the bed in berth 7 with his hands loose between his knees, and the gas turned down to a bead, and he said the name again, silently, and then out loud, to the empty compartment. Edward. Nothing happened. The steam pipe ticked. The carriage found its rhythm over the points at the north end of the station, and settled into it. He said it again, and this time something did happen, and it was not what he had spent 4.5 years being afraid of. He had believed, without ever once examining the belief, in the way one does not examine the floor, that the name was a kind of switch, and that if he ever touched it he would be finished, that he would come apart entirely in public, in a church, in front of the firm, and never be put back together, and so he had built the whole of his life around not touching it. He had taken the far contracts. He had left the dedication services. He had let the house in Rochester Terrace go quiet, and had allowed his wife to carry the thing alone in the front room, while he worked 10 hours a day in cold buildings 100 miles off, and had told himself that this was strength, and had been rather proud of it, in a grim way, the way a man is proud of a limp he refuses to discuss. You have been leaning on that instrument for 10 years, and now there is nothing to lean on. He put his face in his hands, and it came, not as a bar going through him, not as the annihilation he had rehearsed, but as a great slow swelling pressure behind the eyes and in the throat, rising and rising and rising, and he sat with it and let it rise, and at some point he discovered that he was crying, properly, for the first time since the 4th day at Ilmington, and that he was not making very much noise about it, and that the train was going on north exactly as before. It went on a long while, 16 minutes if anyone had been counting, and nobody was. He thought about Edward at 6 in the yard at Bayham Street, sitting on an upturned crate hitting a piece of pipe metal with a mallet for 40 minutes because he liked the noise. He thought about Edward at 15, scribing a soundboard and getting it wrong and refusing help. He thought about the last morning, which was an ordinary morning, in which they had discussed the weather and a cheese sandwich and a beam. And then, at the end of it, when it had gone through him and out the other side and left him wrung and hot-eyed and oddly light, he thought about a thing he had not permitted himself to think about at all. The boy had been happy, not in general, though he had been that too, but in the trade. He had chosen it at 6 and never wavered. He had loved the metal shop and the smell of hot size and the ridiculous private language of it. the languids and the toes and the shift. He had once, at 17, voiced a single stopped diapason pipe entirely by himself while his father was out, and had done it competently, and had left it standing in the middle of the bench like a cat leaving a mouse. Thomas had never allowed that memory in the door because it came attached to the scaffold, and now, sitting in a dark compartment somewhere north of Luncardy at 10 minutes to 6 in the morning, he let it in, and he found that it did not bring the scaffold with it at all. It came in on its own, quite lightly, and stood there. He wiped his face on the back of his wrist, and then, because that was inadequate, on the corner of the sheet, which he supposed the company would forgive. And then Thomas Iveson lay back on the pillow in his shirt, with his coat over the blanket for the extra warmth, and his shoulders, which had been up somewhere near his ears since the autumn of 1904, so long that he had entirely forgotten they were there, came down. He noticed it happen. That was the strange part. He felt them go, 1.5 inches, into the pillow, and the muscles across the top of his back, which had been holding something for 4.5 years, put it down. The wind is steady, he thought drowsily and without any particular sense, and did not manage to finish the thought, because the tide had already started to come in. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It came the way water comes into a lock when the sluice is lifted, not with a rush, not violently, but as an unhurried, unarguable, general rising, 1 inch, and then another inch, with nothing to see on the surface but a slow turning and the boat lifting off the mud. It began behind his eyes. The heat and the swelling of the crying had left a thick, warm ache there, and now the ache spread outward and softened and lost its edges, and became indistinguishable from the warmth of the compartment and the warmth of the blanket, and stopped being pain at some point that he could not identify and did not notice. His hands opened on the blanket, the right one, with its pale burn shaped like the Isle of Man, and its calluses along the first joints, and the 28 years of small, precise cruelty done to metal with knives and files, uncurled and lay palm upward, and the tension went out of the thumb. His jaw went. His breathing dropped from his chest into his belly and got longer. The train ran. Ta-tum, ta-tum. That 4-beat figure under him at 1.5 seconds. The front bogie and the rear, endlessly, patiently, for mile after mile of a country he had never seen and could not see. He had listened to it all night as a sound. Now he stopped listening to it and simply lay in it and let it move him. And it moved him very slightly from side to side, 1 inch each way, a rocking so small and so regular that no infant on earth has ever been rocked more expertly. The steam pipe under the window ticked as it took the cold air. Once, distantly, the whistle went for a crossing, that rough Caledonian note, thinned by a mile of coaches, and it came into the top of his sleep and was absorbed there and made no difference. Warmth. That was the last thing that was clearly a thing. The heater grating was 3 feet from his shoulder, and the blanket was over him, and his coat was over the blanket, and his feet, which had been cold since Euston, were not cold anymore, and the entire length of him from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet was one continuous, unremarkable animal warmth. The water came up over his knees. Images went past without asking to be looked at. The great smoke haze under the roof at Euston, with the arc lamps burning in it like small, hard moons, a furnace door opening on a slag tip, and the whole sky going rose, a platelayer's hut on Beatic with a wisp of smoke, and, presumably, a man inside with tea. 6 white cups in a rack with a bar across them, a card of ready-threaded needles pinned to a panel, a bench under a north window with a wind chest and a treadle, and a boy of 17 who had left a single stopped diapason pipe standing in the middle of it, speaking perfectly, without a word of explanation. The water came up over his chest. There was one last brief stirring of the machinery, the old reflex, the thing that had woken him every night for 4.5 years, some part of him drawing breath to say, "And then he went up the outside of the scaffold, and I called him." And it rose and turned over and did not finish the sentence. "I know," he thought from a long way down. "I know, steady wind, everything after." The lock filled. The boat came off the mud and floated. At 11 minutes past 6 on the morning of the 9th of February, 1909, 4 miles south of Dunkeld, in berth 7 of a London and Northwestern sleeping carriage, running north at 44 miles an hour through the snow, Thomas Iveson of Rochester Terrace, Camden Town, voicer of organ pipes, fell asleep. He slept. The train went on without him, as trains do. It ran up through Burnham and into the pass at Dunkeld, where the Tay comes down between wooded hills, black water and white banks, and the beaches standing up out of the snow with every branch outlined in it. It went by Ballinlough and Pitlochry, where 3 people got on and were very quiet about it, and into the pass of Killiecrankie, and over the viaduct there, 54 feet of iron above a gorge full of snow-covered birch, with the river invisible far below and going hard. At Blair Athol, a second engine came on at the front for the climb, and the fireman leaned out and said something to a signalman about the wind at the summit, and the signalman said something back that made him laugh, and neither of them was heard by anyone else in the world. Then the long ascent, 17 miles of it, up Glengarry, out of the trees, past Struan, past Dalnacardosh, the country opening, until there was nothing on either side but white moorland, going up into cloud, no wall, no tree, no house, only the 2 lines of rail and the telegraph poles, marching away with a stripe of snow on the windward side of every one. At Dalnaspidal, the train ran through without stopping. There were snow fences up on the eastern side, standing black and ragged, and the drifts lay behind them in long, smooth, curved shapes like something poured. Dougal MacBean, standing at the end window of his carriage with a cloth over his shoulder, looked out at the place as he had looked out at it 400 or 500 times since 1895, and thought about it for about as long as it takes to fill a cup, and then went to see about the boots. Drwymuachdar summit, 1,508 feet, the highest main line in Britain, a bare saddle between 2 enormous shoulders of hill, with the cloud down on both of them. The engines came over the top, and the sound of the working stopped, and the train began to run down toward Speyside, with the snow whirling up in a fine dust behind the last vehicle. In berth 7, nothing at all was happening. The man on the bed had not moved for an hour and a half. His mouth had come slightly open. One hand lay palm up on the blanket with the fingers a little curled, exactly where it had fallen. His breathing had gone so long and so slow that a person watching would have had to wait a while between one breath and the next, and might have grown faintly anxious about it, and would have been wrong to. He did not hear Dalwhinnie, where the loch lay frozen at the edges, and a man was walking a dog on the road with his collar up. He did not hear Newton Moor or Kingussie, where the lady in berth 3 got off at 10 past 7 into a morning of astonishing cold and clear pale gold light, and where a boy of about 11 on the platform stared at the sleeping carriages with an expression of pure and undisguised longing. He did not hear Aviemore, or the Spey running black and quick between white banks, or the cairngorms standing up on the right-hand side at 7:30 in the first of the sun, enormous, rounded, entirely white, so far above everything else that they looked less like mountains than like a second country hung up in the sky. He did not hear the climb to Slocht, or the long descent to Strathdairn, or the crossing of the Findhorn on the viaduct at Tomatin, where the shadow of the whole train ran along the snow of the glen below in a thin, flickering line. The world did what it had always done, which was continue. Down at Bayham Street, the yard would be open by now, and old Rushmere's grandson would be complaining about the price of tin. In Rochester Terrace, a woman would be laying a fire in the front room, alone, and would think of her husband somewhere near Inverness, and hope he had slept, without much expecting it. In 10,000 years, there would be no trace of the line, nor of the town it was going to, nor of any organ built by any man, nor of the entire language in which the word voicing had ever meant anything at all, and the snow would still be lying on Drumwachdar in February, exactly as it lay this morning, and would be no colder and no warmer for any of it. The world did not care. It had never once cared. And a man who had spent 4.5 years believing that his grief was a fault requiring correction slept through the whole of the most beautiful 100 miles in Britain, and was, at last, doing precisely the right thing. At 20 to 8, the guard came through the carriage. Macbean stopped him at the door of number 7, with a hand on his sleeve. "Leave that one," he said. He woke because the train had stopped, and because there was a smell of frying somewhere, and because somebody 2 compartments away laughed. For a moment, he had no idea in the world where he was, or what year it was, and it was the most extraordinary sensation. No church, no scaffold, no name, no date. Simply a warm man, in a warm bed, in a small mahogany room, with light coming round the edge of a blind. Then he remembered, all of it, and it did not knock him down. Thomas Iveson lay quite still for a minute, and took stock of himself, the way he would take stock of an instrument he had not seen for years, carefully, without judgment, listening for what was actually there, rather than what he expected. His eyes were sore. His back ached in the small, pleasant way of a man who has been asleep too long rather than not long enough. He had slept, he calculated, 2 hours, and then he found his watch and looked at it properly, and discovered that he had slept for very nearly 2 hours, and then, apparently, gone back and done it again, because it was 8 minutes past 8. He raised the blind. Inverness station lay under its long glazed roof, with the morning coming in sideways through it, in great pale bars full of steam. The platform was full of people, and none of them was in a hurry. There were fish boxes stacked at the far end. There was a bookstall opening its shutters. There was snow lying on the roof glass, in soft wedges, and dripping steadily off the eaves. And the air that came in when he let the window down 2 inches was so cold and so clean that it made him cough, and it smelled of coal smoke and river water and, faintly, of the sea. Beyond the roof, above the town, he could see a hillside with snow on it and a scatter of houses going up, and away to the left, the castle on its bank, red sandstone, going pink in the low sun. He dressed. He washed his face with the awkward spring tap and did not mind it. He put on his collar with fingers that had gone unaccountably clumsy and took down the mahogany box from the rack and checked, out of 30 years of habit, that the catches were shut. Macbean was at the carriage door with his cap on and his list in his hand, and the entire manner of a man who had never in his life sat up all night talking. "Berth 7, he said. "Mr. Iveson, Inverness. Mr. Macbean. You'll find the station hotel through the door there, and they'll give you breakfast, whether you've a room or no." He handed down the bag. "They do a very fine kipper, and I've no interest in the matter whatever." Thomas stood on the platform and looked up at him. There were about 11 things he wanted to say, and every single one of them would have been an embarrassment to both of them, and he was English, and Macbean was a Highlander, and it was 10 past 8 in the morning on a public platform. "Thank you," he said, "for the cocoa." "Aye," said Dougal Macbean. "Well, it's mostly what the job is." And then, as Thomas turned away, "Mr. Iveson." "Yes, 6 weeks, you said. On yon organ." The attendant nodded at the roof. "The town, the general north. I'm on this run the Tuesday and the Friday." "I'd be pleased to hear how it comes on." "You shall," said Thomas. "And when it's finished, if you're not on duty, you might come and hear it." Macbean considered that with great seriousness. I might, he said. I'd not know what I was listening to. That, said Thomas, is entirely the point of it. He walked down the platform through the steam and the fish boxes and the pale bars of sunlight, with the mahogany box under his left arm where it had been since Euston, and he went out through the doors into the cold and stood a moment on the steps looking at a town he had never seen. He would go to the cathedral this afternoon and open the blowing plant first, before he looked at a single pipe, because it would be the leather. It was always the leather. He would be 6 weeks about the work, and he would do it well. And on Sunday, he would write to Ellen, and this time, he would not write about the coal and her sister at Ware. He would write, I slept last night, all the way from Perth, and I said his name out loud to a stranger on a train, and the world did not end, and I find that I can say it. Edward, I am going to keep saying it until it is an ordinary word in our house again, because I have let the wind fail in that house for 4 years, and it was never the pipes that were at fault, my dear. It was never once the pipes. Above the station roof, a gull went over, complaining. The snow dripped off the eaves, and somewhere down the platform, in a carriage that would go south again that night, a man was refilling a spirit stove and setting 6 white cups back in their rack behind the bar, ready, in case anybody could not sleep.